The following program is presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.
He taught his colleagues to turn the parliamentary machine on itself, to filibuster, to devise every possible legal parliamentary form of obstruction until the affairs of the empire came to a standstill.
KTCA TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis, presents Ireland Rediscovered, a series of 13 programs dealing with the significance of the Irish nation, which has emerged to statehood in our own times. Dr. John McKiernan, head of the Department of English at the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul and an authority on Ireland, is host and lecturer. The title of this program is Travails End. Here again is Professor McKiernan.
The title of this lecture, Travails End, might suggest to us that Irish history could form the core of a humanistic study, a study, if you will, of human tragedy. I know the term tragedy disturbs some people, but tragedy is heroic, and tragedy ennobles us, showing us something of the unconquerable spirit of man, the indomitable spirit of man. And in that sense, tragedy is something very dear to us all. And certainly the whole history of the rise again of the Irish nation gives us this sense of triumph over unbelievable, incredible disaster, century upon century. I say this to you because the past two lectures have been filled with rather grim details, and certainly today's will present very harrowing aspects of the history of the 19th century. But we must remember that the ultimate result was triumph. It was travails end. And in that sense, I think, the history of Ireland, and particularly of the disasters of the 19th century, these facts, this history, does lift all of us. Because if other men have so triumphed, so can you and I today. Now, you will recall that at the end of the last lecture, we had discussed the Irish Parliament, that very interesting phenomenon, the Dublin Parliament from 1783 to 1800, before, in other words, the union or the amalgamation with Britain. This brief period, as you will recall from our last lecture, this brief period was filled with an extraordinary economic growth, a cultural growth, a wave of inspiration over the country. Now, we must remember that that parliament was not representative. It did not represent really the Gaelic nation. It did not represent 4/5 or more of the country. Catholics, for instance, were not allowed to enter it. But despite the fact that it was not really a representative parliament, it was an important one. Certainly it itself felt the shame of its non-representative quality, and had it continued in existence, it would, we can be certain, have taken steps to have remedied its defects. Because for all of its non-representative quality, it was an Irish parliament, and this was the most important aspect or feature of it. However, excuse me, as we know, the parliament was abolished by the Act of Union, and this left Dublin and Ireland in a very sorry state. The representatives of Ireland were now transferred to an imperial parliament in London, where, of course, they formed a relatively insignificant minority. They could easily be outvoted by 5-1. The consequences of that union for Ireland were very serious indeed. For Dublin, for instance, although you may find it hard or difficult to believe when I tell you now, thinking of the modern city, which, however, has again showed a surprising growth with the return of independence. But if we think of Dublin at the early part of the 20th century, it was a relatively unimportant city amongst the cities of Europe. And yet to go back only 100 years to 1800, the time of the Act of Union, we find that it was one of the more important capitals of Europe, a very distinguished capital. Consequent upon the Act of Union, this distinction passed rapidly because the legislators of the country moved eastward to England. They had to. The aristocrats of the country, speaking now in terms of wealth, left the country. Literature, theater, such as it had been, left the country or looked to London. So that there was a serious decline culturally and economically. And the 19th century then shows this steady decline. This then was one, or a summary, of the more important consequences of the Act of Union. There was, however, one other, very significant and most unfortunate. Shortly before the Act of Union had been passed, and one might almost say as part of the preparation for its passing, the British government, or governors in Ireland, because you see the ministry that was superior to the Irish Parliament, that ministry was still in British hands. That ministry encouraged the rise, particularly in the northeastern part of Ireland, of a secret order called the Orange Society, or the Orange Lodges. We sometimes speak today of the Orange Men. This was a most regrettable and unfortunate growth because the English ministers determined to use this society for purposes of stirring up religious antagonism, a most serious consequence, as you might understand, wherever it might take place in the history of the world. In our time, we are becoming ecumenically minded. This, of course, was the direct opposite of anything of that sort. But the curious thing, or the important thing, is that the English interests decided now that Protestantism could be used as a test of loyalty to Britain. And the Orange Lodges now had a dual purpose: to preserve or promote Protestantism, and to preserve or promote the connection between Ireland and England, the connection, in other words, which made Ireland subservient to England. Now, this was all the more surprising because in view of the fact that the Presbyterians in particular had been the most liberal component of the Irish population. Actually, during the Revolution of 1798, the British had had to hang a Presbyterian minister even. Many of the patriots, if we shall call them that, taking the Irish point of view, many of the patriots in that rebellion were themselves leading Presbyterian and other Protestant men. So that the extraordinary thing is that even up to the present year, the Protestant population has contributed most heavily to the cultural renaissance, to the political renaissance, and the economic renaissance. But despite that, the Orange Lodges were encouraged from just shortly before 1800, right down to the present year, to represent, to speak officially, as it were, in the name not only of Protestantism, but of maintaining the connection with England. Now, this continues and can be seen even today, for instance, in the treatment meted out to the Catholic minority in the northeastern part of the country, specifically Northern Ireland, where housing discrimination and job discrimination and other sorts of discrimination are practiced against them. Now, the great movements of the 19th century can be summed up under two headings. Perhaps they could in any century. But we might speak of the efforts for parliamentary reform, and we might speak of the undercover or revolutionary movements. In either one of these, we shall be able to point to the development of events in 19th century Ireland. Now to take the first, the efforts for parliamentary reform. Certainly the common people of Ireland, as the common people of any country in the world, would sooner do something peacefully than do it by war or bloodshed, by violence of any sort. During the early part of the 19th century, conditions in Ireland grew worse and worse. The mass of people had little to eat, little to work at, little hope for the future. Their housing was deplorable and continued to become worse and worse. The need in Ireland was for the most simple, elemental form of economic justice. We know, those of us who have studied our lessons carefully, we know that the situation in England and even in America left a great deal to be desired, in the sense that the working man often had to work 12, 14, 15-hour days, sometimes 7 days a week. But far worse than that, the conditions in Ireland bordered on slavery. As a matter of fact, we might say that the average Irishman of the early part of the 19th century lived an existence that was far worse than the existence of the sharecroppers in our own country earlier this century, particularly, perhaps, during the 30s. A French traveler, there were testimony, there were comments that have been left to us in books and diaries and so on. Many travelers from England, from America, from other countries. But let me quote a French traveler, Gustave, think of his name in just a second, please. Gustave de Beaumont. Gustave de Beaumont told or left a record that in his opinion, the condition of the Irish was far worse than the condition of the slaves in the United States of America. And we know how inhuman, or at least subhuman, those conditions were. But he said the conditions of the Irish were those of sheer wretchedness, unsurpassed by anything he had seen in his travels anywhere. One indication of this was the diet of the people. We may laugh and joke about Irish potatoes, but it was a grim fact and a very ugly fact that 3 out of 4 Irishmen during the first half of the 19th century lived on potatoes. Now, when I say lived on potatoes, I mean potatoes for breakfast, such as it was, potatoes for lunch, potatoes for dinner, although I'm sure that these meals may not have been dignified by those names. We have the complaint of an Irish poet, one of the peasant poets, shall we say, who left us a rhyme in which he says, "Prátaí sa lo is prátaí sa nithe." And he continues it, but I'll continue in English. Potatoes by day and potatoes by night. And if I were to arise in the middle of the night, I'd have nothing to look forward to but potatoes. A rather monotonous diet, shall we say, and drop it at that. Now, this was not because the country was poor. It was not because the country was shiftless. It was simply because the country was oppressed. 75% of the land in Ireland was under cultivation, and under cultivation in wheat and other crops. Livestock in great numbers was successfully raised, but all of this was exported. And you would hardly believe, except that I shall illustrate from contemporary documents and give you the visual proof, you would hardly believe that a great proportion of the population annually had to beg for its living on the roads of Ireland every summer. Well, the consequence of this, of course, was discontent. You could not expect a people to be very happy that had to live in such a precarious, marginal existence. The question only remained, how was this to be remedied? By parliamentary means or by revolutionary means? The question has always plagued the history of Ireland. A great leader of the early part of the 20th century, Daniel O'Connell, succeeded in bringing a kind of unity, and the unity of effective action amongst the people. In 1829, he succeeded in achieving what is called Catholic emancipation. Remember the Negro emancipation of the Civil War in our country. In 1829, we speak of Catholic emancipation in Ireland. By this, we mean that many of the Catholics, for the first time in hundreds of years, were now allowed to be elected for to certain offices, and certain Catholics were now allowed to vote. Well, now we come to the middle of the century, and we come to that ugly word famine. You have all heard of the Irish famine. I doubt that you have all heard what I shall tell you about it in this lecture. And so that I may let you judge for yourselves, I shall again use contemporary illustrations. A blight, a potato blight, occurred in all of Western Europe in 1845. The crops of most of the nations of Western Europe were a partial or complete loss. The same blight struck Ireland, and the Irish crops suffered. Somehow the people managed to live through, under what dreadful conditions we can only guess, and in the spring of 1846 planted another crop. This too was struck by the blight, and the conditions in Ireland were appalling, unbelievable. These are actual illustrations, etchings, drawn by English artists who visited Ireland during this dreadful, we might well say awful, time. The winter of the year was possibly one of the worst in the whole history of Europe, one of the worst calamities in the whole history of Europe, particularly, of course, during a period of peace. People died by the roadsides, and there just weren't ways in which to get them off. I have a bound volume here of the Illustrated London News, which in its January 1847 issue, it's a little bit awkward to handle, gives us an artist's sketch of a cart carrying away the dead. You see the body piled upon the cart here. We read in this very same account, the reporter tells us that some of these bodies were lying on the road for weeks, that this particular one had been there 11 days. Just no way in which to get them carted away and taken care of. A dreadful time, certainly. We have no doubt about that. Now, this aggravated the situation because people cannot stand by and be treated in such manner. You can't expect them. And Daniel O'Connell, whose picture you saw before, and who had successfully given some sort of political unity and expression to the people, was contemptuously referred to in this time as the king of the beggars, so appalling was the lot of the ordinary man. Daniel O'Connell counseled peace. He counseled parliamentary maneuvers and so on. But a younger generation was growing up. In 1829, O'Connell had been successful in bringing the people together for effective action. But 20 years later, another generation is losing its patience. And leaders like John Mitchell, a very fiery prose writer, a Protestant leader, as most of the leaders were, and Thomas Davis, who gave an effective poetic voice to the new movement, John Mitchell and Thomas Davis and other men of that period who were called the Young Islanders, they counseled something else. They said, we just cannot stand by and see our people suffer as they do. And they counseled revolt. They said, England has never given us anything else but what we have demanded at the point of a gun. This was the debate then: peaceful means or revolutionary means. O'Connell representing one point of view, the young islanders representing another point of view. There was an unsuccessful revolution in 1848. It didn't accomplish too much. Nor, on the other hand, had O'Connell been able really to accomplish very much. The deaths in Ireland continued at a frightful rate. Actually, between the flight of the people from the country and the deaths from the famine, over a 3-year period, 1,400 people died each day for 3 years. I'm sorry, I'll correct that. They either died or emigrated, and a great percentage of that 1,400 daily for 3 years, a great percentage of that was in deaths. Now, what happened to make the situation worse was that people were also evicted. England now changed its policy in regard to Irish crops, Irish agriculture. Whereas previous to the famine, Ireland had supplied England with grains. Right at this period, about the mid-century, English laws favored the importation of grain from other areas and chose now to have Ireland supply her with meat, which meant that small farms had to go. And here you see the forces representing the forces of English law and order, evicting a man, his family, his wife, from the cottage they lived in. You can see he has here a farm weapon with which he's going to defend himself. Very harrowing scenes indeed. They led inevitably to violence. What other response could we expect men of flesh and blood to make? Not that I counsel it. Simply we know that in normal human reactions, nothing else might be expected. And here, for instance, we have a scene of an arrest. One of these men, several of these men, being escorted to prison now by the forces of British law and order. Over on this page, we have a night search. For instance, here have been found on the highway weapons dropped by some of the peasants who had intended to use them for violent ends. So the 19th century then is a century, like other centuries before it, of great suffering, great tragedy in Ireland, a situation over which the native people had little control, no effective means to speak. Ireland seemed cursed. It seemed as though a great judgment lay over the nation. And when the dead and the departing, at the rate of 1,400 a day, when these, shall I say, this great loss of population, it shook the country in such a way that Ireland has not yet recovered, and it set a pattern of flight from the country that has been one of the most serious problems in Irish history to the present day. But these immigrants, those who left, had no easy way. And I shall show you again, if you will bear with me, while I lift these ponderous tomes. I shall show you some illustrations, the conditions that the immigrants had to suffer. Nothing at all like our trips to Europe, you know. Here, for instance, is a departing scene. The family gathered, the family and friends gathered here to bid farewell. This gave rise to a term in Irish history called the American wake. That is, you know what wake means, the friends coming together to grieve over the loss of a dead one. But here, the people left the country in such numbers, Ireland seemed cursed and damned and a dying, deplorable country, that it was regarded as an American wake. At the base of this page, we have an illustration here now at the ship side. Notice they have to pack their own boxes. Actually, they had to provide their own food on the ship. Over here, show you an illustration again of people on the ship. Notice the accommodations are, by our standards, of course, dreadful, really. No privacy, simply dormitory style here. People sick and dying because the deaths on these ships, due to malnutrition and fever, the deaths themselves were just unbelievable. Well, now this was the greatest event. The greatest event, but one of the most significant events, because this determined a lot. In the first place, it left Ireland with this pattern of flight, of emigration, but it also stirred the resentment of the Irish, because there was no real famine. During each of the years of the famine, more food was taken from the country. Livestock was taken from the country, and grains were taken from the country to satisfy the demands of the landlords in England, those who owned the Irish lands. Had there been a native government, this wouldn't have been permitted. This, of course, is what caused such great resentment in the Irish. They fled to England, they fled to America. And here in 1858, shortly after this great flight to America, was organized the Irish Republican Brotherhood, a secret revolutionary organization whose sole purpose was to finance the successful revolution in Ireland. This came in 1916 with the help of the organization established in America by the people who fled the Great Famine. However, before the end of the century, we come to a great name in Irish history, Irish parliamentary history, as brilliant as O'Connell, far more brilliant perhaps, but at least in another generation. This is the man Charles Stewart Parnell, who had an American sea captain, a hero, an American naval hero, for a grandfather. Charles Stewart Parnell went to the Imperial Parliament in London, organized the Irish parliamentary party there, taught them to turn the parliamentary machine on itself, taught them to filibuster, to practice every legal parliamentary means of obstruction. And he was so successful at this, and so successful at playing the parliamentary game of balance of power, that he forced the affairs of the empire to a halt, and was on his way to doing some good, you might say, parliamentarily speaking, for the country. You know the history, perhaps, of Parnell. It has formed more than one American book and the basis for more than one American play or movie. He was brought to his ruin by a woman, if we shall express it that way. And Parnell passed, and the century ended then with the possible dawn on the horizon, one that we shall explore in the coming lecture. Travails End. It seemed as though the dawn was present.
Ireland Rediscovered is produced by KTCA TV, Twin Cities Area Educational Television Corporation. The next title in this series is Chained Yet Free. Host and lecturer is Dr. John McKiernan. Ireland Rediscovered is directed by Carl Brooklands and produced by Joseph T. McDermott. This program was presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.